The small town of Willow Creek had always been quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name. But 25 years ago, something happened that no one could explain, something that turned the town's peaceful reputation into a whispered nightmare. On a crisp autumn morning in 1999, a group of 28 students walked into their classroom at Willow Creek Elementary. Their teacher, Miss Carter, took attendance as usual. The clock struck 9:15 a.m. Then, just like that, silence. By the time the principal went to check on the class an hour later, they were gone. Every single child vanished. No signs of struggle, no open windows, no footprints leading away. It was as if the entire class had been erased from existence. Investigators swarmed the school, combing through every inch of the room. But there were no answers. No ransom notes, no witnesses, no logical explanation. Parents were devastated, their grief turning into anger as days turned into weeks, then months, then years. The town tried to move on, but the classroom remained untouched, sealed like a tomb, frozen in time. Some believed it was a mass kidnapping. Others whispered about supernatural forces. Eventually, the case faded into legend, another unsolved mystery that no one dared to talk about. But for one mother, the story never ended. Sophia Reynolds had been just 27 when her son Jacob disappeared that day. 25 years later, she still kept his bedroom exactly the same. The toys gathering dust, the closet filled with clothes he never grew into. She never stopped looking, never stopped hoping. And then, on the anniversary of the disappearance, something changed. Sophia was sorting through an old box of Jacob's schoolwork when she found Ita, a crumpled drawing, something he must have made, just days before he vanished. It was a simple picture of his classroom, drawn in bright crayons. The desks, the blackboard, the window set, all looked normal. But then, her eyes landed on something that sent a chill down her spine. In the corner of the drawing, almost hidden behind the scribbled lines, was a shadowy figure. It wasn't a teacher. It wasn't a student. It was something else. And the more she stared at it, the more she felt like it was staring back at her. Her hands shook as she flipped the paper over. There, written in shaky letters, was a single sentence that made her heart stop. "We didn't leave. We were taken." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She had spent years searching for answers, but this was something different, something real. She didn't know how, but she was sure of one thing. She had just found the first clue in 25 years, and she wasn't about to stop now. Sophia sat frozen, the crumpled drawing trembling in her hands. The words on the back stared back at her, sending a cold shiver down her spine. She had spent 25 years searching for something, anything that could explain what had happened to her. Son, and now, out of nowhere, she had a clue. But where had this drawing even come from? Had she seen it before? Why hadn't she noticed it until now? Her pulse pounded in her ears as she traced the tiny, uneven letters with her fingertips. "We didn't leave. We were taken." It was Jacob's handwriting. She was sure of it. But how could that be? He had been just 7 years old when he disappeared, and no one had heard from him since. Had he left this behind as a warning? Or had someone else placed it here, knowing she would eventually find it? Her mind raced as she sifted through the rest of the old papers in the box, but nothing else stood out. Just math worksheets, spelling tests, and messy doodles of superheroes and rockets. But this drawing, this was different. The shadowy figure in the corner unsettled her. It was barely more than a smudge, as if Jacob had been trying to hide it. But why? She grabbed her phone and snapped a picture, then zoomed in. The more she looked at the figure, the more uneasy she felt. It didn't look like a person. Its shape was all wrong, too tall, too thin, with long arms stretching toward the children's desks. Something about it felt wrong. Sophia's breathing quickened. Had the police ever seen this? Had the other parents? She had to find out. Without thinking, She picked up her phone and dialed the first number that came to mind, Eleanor Walsh. Eleanor's daughter, Lily, had vanished that same day. Sophia hadn't spoken to her in years, not really. The parents of the missing children had tried to support each other in the beginning, forming a tight-knit group bound by grief. But as time passed, hope faded, and so did their connections. Some left town, some stopped talking about it altogether. Sophia had stayed, unable to move on. The phone rang once, twice, then a tired voice answered. "Sophia?" Eleanor sounded surprised, hesitant. "Is everything okay?" "Two don't know," Sophia admitted. "I found something about Jacob, about all of them." A pause, then quietly. "What do you mean?" Sophia swallowed hard. "A drawing. I think Jacob made it right before they disappeared. It shows their classroom, but there's something else in it, something strange." She hesitated. "Have you ever found anything like that? Something Lily left behind?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, quieter, almost cautious. "Come over," she said. "Now." Sophia barely remembered grabbing her coat and keys before she was out the door. The cold night air bit at her skin as she drove through town, her mind spinning with questions. What did Eleanor know? Had she found something too? And if she had, why hadn't she ever said anything? Eleanor's house was just on the outskirts of town, tucked away behind a line of bare trees. Sophia parked in the driveway and hurried up the steps. Before she could even knock, the door swung open. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her face pale. She looked older than Sophia remembered, like the years had weighed heavier on her than most. Without a word, she stepped aside, letting Sophia in. Dasin. House was quiet, almost eerily so. A few framed pictures sat on the mantel, old photographs of Lily, frozen in time at 7 years old. A lump formed in Sophia's throat. It was like looking into the past. Eleanor led her to the kitchen, where a shoebox sat on the table. "I found this a year after Lily disappeared," she said, lifting the lid with careful hands. "I never told anyone. I thought maybe I was just seeing what I wanted to see." Sophia leaned in as Eleanor pulled out a small, yellowed notebook. It was filled with Lily's handwriting, uneven and childish. But what made Sophia's breath catch were the drawings. Page after page, Lily had drawn the same thing: her classroom. The desks, the windows, the teacher's desk. And in every single one, the same dark figure loomed in the corner. Sophia's hands clenched around Jacob's drawing. It wasn't just him. Lily had seen it too. Eleanor watched her carefully. "You said Jacob's drawing showed something strange. Does it look like this?" Wordlessly, Sophia unfolded the paper and laid it on the table. Eleanor's face paled as she looked at it. She pressed a trembling hand to her lips. "Oh my God." They sat in silence, staring at the two drawings side by side. Two different children, two different sets of crayon-sewn blue, one red, but the same shadowy figure lurking in the background. "This means something," Sophia whispered. "This can't be a coincidence." Eleanor exhaled shakily. "I don't know what it means, but I know one thing." She looked up, her eyes filled with something between fear and determination. "We're not the only ones who kept looking." Sophia's heart pounded. "Who?" Eleanor hesitated, then stood and crossed the room. She opened a drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. When she handed it to Sophia, her hands were ice cold. Sophia unfolded it carefully. It was an old newspaper clipping from 15 years ago. The headline made her blood run cold. "Local teacher missing last person to see the Willow Creek class before they vanished." Below it was a picture of Miss Carter, their children's teacher. The woman who had taken attendance that morning, the last person to see them before they disappeared. She had vanished too. Sophia's mind reeled. Why had no one talked about this? Had the police ever connected her disappearance to the case? And why had Eleanor been holding on to this for so long? She looked up, her throat dry. "Eleanor, what aren't you telling me?" Eleanor's expression was unreadable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I think she was looking for them." Sophia's stomach twisted. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on her. For the first time in years, she felt closer to the truth. But at the same time, an awful realization crept into her mind. If Miss Carter had been searching for them, and she had disappeared, Tooth and maybe Sophia and Eleanor weren't just uncovering an old mystery. Maybe they were stepping into something far more dangerous. Sophia couldn't take her eyes off the newspaper clipping. Miss Carter had disappeared 15 years ago, 10 years after the children vanished. Why had no one ever connected the two cases? Why had no one talked about this? She looked up at Eleanor, who was staring at the table, her fingers clenched tightly around Lily's notebook. "You should have told me," Sophia said, her voice unsteady. Eleanor sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know. I almost did so many times, but I didn't know what to believe. And then, after a while, I convinced myself it didn't mean anything." She let out a shaky breath. "But seeing Jacob's drawing tonight, it's not just in my head, is it?" Sophia shook her head. "No. Whatever this is, it's real." Eleanor glanced toward the window, her eyes clouded with something unreadable. "There's something else," she admitted quietly. "A few weeks before Miss Carter disappeared, I ran into her at the grocery store. She looked awful thin, tired, like she hadn't slept in weeks. When she saw me, she grabbed my arm and said something that's haunted me ever since." Sophia swallowed hard. "What did she say?" Eleanor hesitated, then met her eyes. She said, "They never left, Eleanor. You just can't see them." The words sent a shiver down Sophia's spine. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Eleanor said, shaking her head. "I asked her, but she just kept saying it over and over. I thought she was losing her mind. And then, a few weeks later, she was gone." Sophia's mind raced. What had Miss Carter figured out? Had she found something? And if she had it gotten her killed or worse? She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "We need to find out what she knew." Eleanor nodded slowly. "But how?" Sophia thought for a moment, then something clicked. "Her house." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You think there's something there?" "It's possible. If she was looking for the kids, maybe she left something behind, notes, journals, anything that might tell us what she found." Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. "Sophia, if there's something there, don't you think the police would have found it by now?" Sophia set her jaw. "Maybe. But what if they didn't? What if no one ever really looked?" Eleanor was silent for a long time. Then finally she stood. "Let's go." They drove through the empty streets, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Miss Carter's house was on the other side of town, an old two-story home that had been abandoned since she disappeared. As they pulled up, the sight of it sent a chill through Sophia. The house was dark, the windows covered in dust and grime. The front porch sagged slightly, the wood warped from years of neglect. It looked like no one had set foot inside for a long time. Eleanor shut off the engine, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Are we really doing this?" Sophia nodded, her pulse hammering in her ears. "We have to." They stepped out of the tow car, the night air thick with silence. As they approached the front door, Sophia reached for the handle, expecting it to be locked. But to her surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway lined with old furniture, covered in white sheets. Dust hung heavy in the air, and the faint scent of something stale lingered. Eleanor hesitated. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" Sophia swallowed. "No, but we're already here." They stepped inside, their footsteps muffled by the dust-covered floor. The house was eerily still, as if frozen in time. Papers were scattered across a desk in the corner, an old lamp knocked over beside them. It looked like someone had left in a hurry or had been taken. Sophia moved toward the desk, her fingers brushing against a stack of notebooks. Most of them were filled with lesson plans and student rosters. But then, at the very bottom, she found something different. A journal. She picked it up, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was hurried, frantic. The entries were dated, the first one written 10 years after the disappearance. "I see them. I know I do. No one believes me, but I know the truth. They never left." Sophia's breath caught in her throat as she flipped to the next page. "They are trying to reach out. I hear them at night, whispering. I think they're trapped." Eleanor peered over her shoulder, her face pale. "Oh my God." Sophia turned another page, her hands trembling. "I made a mistake. I was looking too hard. I think they know. I think they're watching me now." Eleanor took a step back. This is insane." Sophia's hands shook as she turned to the final page. The writing was nearly illegible, scribbled in frantic, uneven strokes. "I know where they are." But there was no explanation, no location, just those 5 words. A loud creak echoed from upstairs. Both women froze. Eleanor grabbed Sophia's arm, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Then, slowly, the floor above them creaked again. Footsteps. Someone or something was up there. The air inside the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sophia's pulse hammered in her ears as she exchanged a panicked glance with Eleanor. The footsteps above them had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, it felt watched. Eleanor gripped Sophia's wrist, her fingers ice cold. "Someone's up there," she whispered. Sophia nodded, barely breathing. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out of that house and never look back. But then she looked down at the journal in her hands. "I know where they are." They had come too far to leave now. Summoning every ounce of courage, she forced herself to take a step forward. The floorboards creaked under her weight. "We have to check," she whispered back. Eleanor hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Okay," she murmured. "But if something feels wrong, we leave. No questions." Sophia swallowed hard. Agreed. They moved toward the staircase, their footsteps slow and deliberate. The wooden steps groaned beneath them as they climbed, the dim light from the street lamp outside casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Halfway up, another noise stopped them cold. A faint shuffling sound, like something being dragged across the floor. Sophia's heart pounded as she reached the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched before them, dark and motionless. 3 doors lined the corridor, one slightly ajar, though others shut tight. Eleanor reached out and gripped Sophia's sleeve. "Which one?" she mouthed. Sophia pointed toward the open door. Whatever had moved was in there. They edged forward, the old wood beneath their feet betraying every step. The door creaked as Sophia pushed it open wider. The room inside was small, lined with dusty bookshelves. An old wooden desk stood against the far wall, its surface cluttered with papers and notebooks. The window was cracked open, the curtains swaying slightly in the cold night breeze. But the room was empty. Sophia exhaled shakily, her fingers tightening around the journal. "No one's here," she whispered. Eleanor let out a breath of relief, stiffened. "Look," she whispered, pointing. On the desk, among the scattered papers, was a single notebook left open. Unlike the others, its pages weren't filled with lesson plans or frantic scribbles. This was different. Sophia stepped closer, her eyes scanning the words written in bold, desperate strokes. I found the door. It's not a place. It's a moment. A crack in time. Her blood ran cold. A moment. What did that even mean? Eleanor was staring at another page. "Sophia," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sophia turned her gaze to where Eleanor was pointing. A photograph was tucked between the pages. Carefully, she pulled it free. It was old and faded, the edges curled with time. The image showed a classroom, the same classroom where Jacob, Lily, and the others had disappeared. The desks were lined. Up neatly, the chalkboard filled with a half-erased lesson, and standing at the front of the room were the students. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. It was them. All 28 of them. They looked exactly as they had 25 years ago, not older, not different. Frozen in time, Eleanor's fingers trembled as she touched the edge of the photo. "They never left," she whispered. Sophia barely heard her. Her focus was locked on something else. In the very back of the classroom, near the window, stood a figure, the same shadowy figure from Jacob and Lily's drawings. Sophia's stomach twisted. It was real. It had always been real. A sudden bang shattered the silence. Both women jumped, whirling toward the hallway. The door at the far end had slammed shut. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate. Moving toward them, Eleanor grabbed Sophia's hand. "We have to go." Sophia didn't argue. Clutching the journal, she turned and bolted for the stairs. The sea. Footsteps behind them quickened. They raced down, the house groaning with every hurried step. As they reached the front door, another sound stopped them in their tracks. A whisper. Faint, but unmistakable. "Help us." Sophia's breath hitched. She turned back, scanning the shadows. The voice had been close, too close, but there was no one there. Eleanor yanked the door open. "Sophia, now!" Sophia hesitated for only a second before plunging out into the night. The door slammed shut behind them as they ran to the car, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Eleanor fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and she threw the car into reverse. As they sped away, Sophia turned back, toward the house. Through the dust-covered window, she saw movement. A flicker of something just beyond the glass. And then, in the dim glow of the streetlight, she saw them. The children standing in the window, watching. Not moving, not blinking, just watching. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as the figures in the window remained perfectly still, their faces barely visible in the darkness. The car lurched forward as Eleanor pressed down on the gas, her hands white-knuckled against the steering wheel. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them could. The image of those unmoving children was burned into Sophia's mind. They hadn't aged. They hadn't changed. They were exactly as they had been 25 years ago. The tires screeched as Eleanor took a sharp turn, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. "Tell me I didn't just see that," she finally whispered. Sophia's hands trembled as she clutched the old journal to her chest. "I can't," she said. "Because I saw it too." Eleanor shook her head, swallowing hard. "This doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense." Sophia stared out the window, her heart still racing. "Miss Carter knew," she murmured. "She saw them. She was trying to find them." Her grip on the journal tightened. She was right, Eleanor. They never left. Eleanor exhaled sharply. Then where the hell have they been all this time? Sophia didn't have an answer. But deep down, she knew that the photograph, the journal, and the shadowy figure from the drawings, they were all connected. And if they wanted answers, they had to go back to where it all started. The school Eleanor must have realized it too, because, without a word, she turned the car toward Willow Creek Elementary. The building had been abandoned for years, left to decay after the tragedy. No one wanted to send their children to a school where an entire class had vanished without a trace as they pulled up. The sight of it sent a chill through Sophia. The windows were dark, the front doors locked shut with rusted chains. Vines crawled up the brick walls, and the old playground sat empty, its swings swaying slightly in the wind. Eleanor put the car in park, but didn't move. "Are we really doing this?" she asked quietly. Sophia nodded. "We have to." They stepped out into the cold night, their footsteps crunching against the gravel. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something stale, like a place that had been forgotten. Sophia ran her fingers along the rusted chains wrapped around the front doors. "We need another way in." Eleanor scanned the building. "Back." "Entrance?" They moved quickly, circling around to the rear of the school. Most of the windows were boarded up, but as they reached the side entrance, Sophia noticed something strange. The door was open, not broken. Not forced, just open. As if someone had been expecting them. Eleanor hesitated. "I don't like this." Sophia didn't either. But they had come too far to turn back now. She pushed the door open wider, revealing the darkened hallway beyond. The air inside was thick, filled with the scent of old paper and dust. Their footsteps echoed as they stepped inside, the building's silence pressing down on them. The hallway was lined with classroom doors, their small windows clouded with grime. Old bulletin boards still clung to faded flyers and children's drawings frozen in time. Sophia reached for the journal, flipping to the last page. "I know where they are." A faint sound broke the silence. A whisper, both women froze. The sound hadn't come from behind them. It had come from ahead. Sophia's pulse quickened. "Did you hear that?" Eleanor nodded, her face pale. "We shouldn't be here." But Sophia couldn't stop now. She took a cautious step forward, then another. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Help us." Sophia's stomach twisted. It was the same voice she had heard in Miss Carter's house. Then, ahead of them, a classroom door creaked open. Eleanor grabbed Sophia's arm. "We are absolutely not going in there." Sophia swallowed hard. "We have to." Slowly she stepped forward and pushed the door open the rest of the way. The classroom was exactly as it had been in the photograph. The desks were still lined up neatly, the chalkboard covered in faint markings. Dust floated in the air, catching, the dim moonlight filtering through the broken window, and at the front of the room stood a single desk. Miss Carter's desk. A notebook sat open on its surface. Sophia's hands trembled as she approached it. The pages were yellowed with age, but the ink was fresh. Someone had been writing in it. She leaned closer, her eyes scanning the first few lines. "They are still here. But they are not alone." A sudden noise sent a jolt of fear through her. A chair scraped across the floor behind her. She spun around. The classroom was empty, but the desks, they had moved. Eleanor gasped, taking a step back. "Sophia." Then, before either of them could react, the whisper returned. "You have to see." And then, in the blink of an eye, the classroom was full. Children sat at every desk, their faces turned toward the front of the room. Their clothes were old, their hair neatly combed, exactly as they had been 25 years ago. Sophia's breath hitched. "Jacob?" The boy in the third row turned slowly. His eyes met hers, and he smiled. It was not a child's smile. It was something else entirely. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as Jacob's eerie smile held her in place. The other children remained, still their faces blank, their eyes reflecting something unnatural. A chill ran down her spine. They weren't supposed to be here. This wasn't possible. Eleanor grabbed her arm, whispering urgently, "Sophia, we need to go. Now." But Sophia couldn't move. Her pulse pounded as Jacob slowly stood, the chair legs scraping against the floor in an awful, dragging sound. The other children followed, moving in perfect unison, their expressions unchanged. "We came back," Jacob said, his voice soft but carrying through the room. But we never left. Sophia's mouth went dry. What happened to you? She whispered. Jacob tilted his head, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. She opened the door. Sophia exchanged a panicked glance with Eleanor. Who? The one who was looking for us, Jacob said, stepping closer. She saw what she wasn't supposed to see. Miss Carter. Eleanor tugged at Sophia's sleeve, her voice shaking. Sophia, we have to, the whisper returned. You have to see. The room tilted. The air thickened, pressing in on them. Sophia's vision blurred, the world shifting around her. She felt herself falling now, being pulled into something vast and empty, and then, suddenly, she was standing in the same classroom. But it wasn't abandoned anymore. The walls were bright, the desks were clean. The children were there, laughing, talking, completely unaware. The day they disappeared. Sophia's heart pounded as she turned, searching for anything, any clue, any warning. She spotted Miss Carter at her desk, flipping through papers, oblivious to what was coming. A shadow moved. In the doorway, it wasn't a person. It wasn't anything human. A twisted, shifting darkness bled into the room like ink spilling through water. The air crackled with something ancient, something hungry. The children didn't notice, but Miss Carter did. She looked up, her face draining of color. She whispered something under her breath, her hands shaking. And then, the room collapsed into darkness. Sophia gasped, stumbling backward as the world snapped back to the present. She was in the abandoned classroom again, her chest heaving, her body drenched in cold sweat. The children were still there, standing in the exact same places, watching, waiting. Eleanor clutched her arm. What just happened? Sophia shook her head, trying to steady her breathing. I saw it. The day they disappeared. It wasn't them. Something took them. Jacob's smile widened. Now you understand. Sophia's fingers curled into fists. How do we stop it? Jacob blinked. You don't. The whisper came again, louder this time. The door is open. Wind slammed through the room, knocking over desks and sending papers flying. The walls trembled, the very foundation groaning as something unseen stirred. Eleanor grabbed Sophia's wrist, pulling her toward the door. Run! They bolted into the hallway, the sound of footsteps echoing behind them, hundreds of footsteps. The children weren't chasing them, but something else was. The building groaned as they reached the back exit. Eleanor shoved the door open, and they stumbled outside, gasping for air. The school loomed behind them, its windows dark, its presence heavy with something they could no longer ignore. And then, the whispers stopped. Sophia turned back, her heart pounding. The school was silent again, empty. The children were gone. Eleanor pressed a hand to her forehead. What just happened? Sophia looked down at the journal still clutched in her hands. The final words on the last page had changed. The door is open. And it never closed. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't over. It had never been over. The children hadn't been saved. They had been waiting. And now, whatever had taken them was free. Eleanor leaned against the car, her breath unsteady, hands gripping her knees as she tried to process everything. The cold air bit at Sophia's skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was still trapped in that classroom, in the whispers, in the way Jacob had smiled. The words in the journal echoed in her head. The door is open, and it never closed. Eleanor finally straightened, her face pale under the streetlights. What does that mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophia shook her head. I don't know. She wanted to believe that stepping out of that school had ended it, that the children were finally gone, that whatever had taken them was locked away again. But deep down, she knew better. It had never been about saving them. They were never coming back. because they had never really left. A long silence stretched between them. Eleanor rubbed her arms, glancing back at the school. So what now? Sophia looked down at the journal in her hands. Miss Carter had spent years trying to find the truth. And she had found it. But it had cost her everything. "We need to find her," Sophia said, her voice steadier than she felt. Eleanor frowned. "Miss Carter, she's the only one who's ever gotten close to this," Sophia said. "She knew something. Maybe she still does." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "Okay," she said. "But first, we're getting out of here." Sophia didn't argue. They climbed into the car, and Eleanor pulled away from the school without looking back. But Sophia did. Just for a second. The building loomed in the rearview mirror, dark and silent. But in one of the windows, she swore she saw movement. A flicker of something just beyond the glass. A child's face. Watching. Sophia forced herself to look away. The drive back to town was quiet, the tension thick between them. Neither of them spoke until Eleanor finally parked in front of Sophia's house. The engine hummed softly, the only sound in the stillness of the night. Eleanor turned to her. "You okay?" Sophia exhaled. "No," she admitted. Eleanor nodded. "Yeah, me neither." For a moment, it felt like everything might sink in, the fear, the impossibility of it all, the fact that they had just stood in a room full of children who had disappeared 25 years ago. But there was no time to process it. Not yet. Sophia gripped the journal tighter. "Tomorrow," she said, "we find Miss Carter." Eleanor agreed, but neither of them moved. The weight of the night still clung to them, refusing to let go. Finally, Eleanor sighed. "Get some sleep," she said, "if that's even possible." Sophia wasn't sure it was, but she nodded anyway and stepped out of the car. The house was quiet when she walked inside. Too quiet, the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She locked the door behind her, double-checking it before she finally let herself breathe. Upstairs, she set the journal on the desk and collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion hitting her all at once. But even as her body begged for rest, her mind wouldn't let her sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them, the children, their blank faces, Jacob's unnatural smile. The way the desks had shifted when no one was looking, and the whisper, "You have to see." Sophia forced her eyes open, her heart pounding. The air in her room felt different, heavier. She swallowed hard and turned toward the journal. The pages fluttered, moved by an unseen force, and when they finally settled, there was something new, a fresh message. It's not over. Sophia's pulse thundered in her ears. She grabbed the journal, flipping through the pages. The ink from Miss Carter's old notes had started to smudge, as if something unseen was trying to erase them. And then, on the last page, 3 new words appeared. "They are waiting." Sophia slammed the book shut, her breath unsteady. She reached for her phone, dialing Eleanor's number with shaking hands. It rang once, twice. "Then I see them," Eleanor whispered. Sophia froze. "What?" "They're here," Eleanor said, her voice hollow. "Outside my house, just standing there." Sophia's blood ran cold. She pushed back her curtains, her hands trembling. The street outside was empty. No movement, no figures. Nothing, but Eleanor wasn't lying, because Sophia suddenly felt it too. Something was watching. Something had followed them home. And now, it wasn't just waiting. It was here.